Well, hey there, friends. I'm your host, Penny, and this is Criminally Nerdy. How are you, my dearest darlings? It's back to school week over here, so it's a shit show circus of getting everything together and ready. And of course, I have to block out time to ugly cry. This is my littlest's last year in preschool, so next year my last baby will be in kindergarten. I'm in a glass case of emotion. In podcast world, this is episode 21. Our little baby podcast is now old enough to drink. JK, it's 5 a.m. That was a Sprite. But cheers to episode 21. Here's to many, many more to come. I was hoping I could solicit some ideas from you all. I've started trying to figure out TikTok. I know, I'm ancient. I've made a couple videos, but I wouldn't say that I'm great at it. And I would like for my next video to be a little bit more personal, a little more engaging. So I ask you, what would you like to ask me? Is there something you would like to know about me? About the podcast? About the chemical composition of a banana? Shoot me an email or a message and let me know, and I'll try to put together a Q&A/getting to know you video someday. Not a whole lot else happening over here this week other than I wanted to say hello to our new listeners. Welcome to the gathering of true crime geekery. Oh, and one last thing before we jump in. I wanted to say rest in peace, Bob Newhart, a.k.a. Professor Proton, a.k.a. Papa Elf. Someone please check on Will Ferrell and Jim Parsons. Today's episode is airing on July 29th, which is National Lasagna Day. Are you kidding me? Guys, I make the best lasagna. So, call into work. Tell your boss that you would much rather miss out on a Monday morning meeting than miss out on the opportunity to stuff your face with pasta and then take a well-deserved carb nap. It's also National Lipstick Day, so if they have a problem with it, tell them to slap some on, pucker up, and kiss your ass. Just kidding, don't say that. Today, we come to our conclusion of the horrific serial killer who targeted vulnerable young women and then proceeded to abduct, rape, torture, and murder them in the Alaskan wilderness. This is part 2 of Robert Hansen, also known as the Butcher Baker. I must warn again, this is an upsetting case. We will be discussing sexual assault, stalking, rape, torture, and murder. So, steel your nerves. My sources for this case were allthingsinteresting.com, lelandhale.com, the ID show Very Scary People, and the accompanying ID podcast called Mind of a Monster, The Butcher Baker. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, pause and go do that now so that you're all caught up. In summary, law enforcement in Anchorage, Alaska is dealing with an epidemic of missing women, primarily sex workers and dancers from the 4th Avenue area. They had found the bodies of Joanne Messina, Eklutna Annie, and Sherry Morrow. Detective Maxine Farrell has put the missing women's case at the top of her priority list, believing that there is a serial killer at work, even though her superiors have tried to shut her down. Of her 3 main suspects, her instincts are pointing her in the direction of Robert Hansen. The problem is, he is continually slipping through the cracks. He was convicted of assault with a deadly weapon during his attempt to kidnap Susie Hebbard, but per his plea deal, never faced charges for the kidnap and rape of Patty Roberts in 1971. He was positively identified in the kidnapping and assault of Christy Hayes in 1979, but investigators working Christy's case took Roberts' word over hers, with him saying it was a simple dispute over money, the same excuse he gave in Patty's case. He was reported multiple times for the subsequent stalking of Christy Hayes, but nothing was done. Sherry Morrow's body was found in September of 1982. Her roommate Susie was the last person to see her alive when she walked her to her appointment with Robert Hansen in 1981. Unfortunately, she never went to the police out of fear. And to top it off, Alaska was in the midst of converting all of their records into digital format, so the information was not easily accessible between departments. But thanks to some dedicated investigators, that was all about to change. I do want to make one correction before we dive back in. In my last episode, I said that law enforcement had been quoted as considering Christy Hayes a bottom feeder. That was incorrect. It was Christy Hayes' daughter who was quoted many years later as saying she felt that law enforcement didn't care because they considered women like her mother to be bottom feeders. Christy Hayes reported Robert Hansen's stalking of her on multiple occasions and nothing was done. Let me be clear when I say it does not matter what someone does for work. If they are being stalked, harassed, assaulted, or fear for their safety, it is your job to serve and protect them. They did not protect Cindy Hayes, and they did not serve their community by ignoring her. That is not to say that all of the officers in Anchorage had this mindset. There were some wonderful, hardworking, committed officers, some of whom we will be discussing today. I am speaking specifically to the ones that let their bias get in the way of investigating a crime because they had the word of a middle-class man over a woman who worked in the adult entertainment industry when I say, I stand by my statement that you are the fucking bottom feeder. On Sunday, June 13th, Officer Greg Baker was dispatched after a man named Robert Yount said he had dropped off a young woman at a motel after a very strange encounter. He had been driving down the road near Merrill Airfield when she flagged him down. She was barefoot, handcuffed, and panicked. He picked her up and offered to take her to the police station, but she declined and asked to be dropped off at a motel instead. Still concerned about her safety, he stopped and called the police after dropping her off and asked that they go check on her because something just didn't feel right. Officer Baker and his partner arrived at the motel to find the woman alone, still handcuffed, and hyperventilating. They were able to unlock the handcuffs and calm her down. They then asked her name and what happened. I don't think they were prepared for what she was about to tell them or the long road that would lie ahead. The woman was 17-year-old Cindy Paulson. She had recently come to Alaska from Portland. She had been working 4th Avenue the night before when a man pulled up next to her. He inquired about her services, they agreed on a price, and Cindy got into his car. He drove off and parked, and Cindy began to perform oral sex. While doing this, the man was somehow able to get a handcuff on one of her wrists. He then pulled her head up, put a .357 Magnum revolver in her face, and snapped the other cuff on. Cindy was incredibly smart, so though terrified, she made note of every detail she could, knowing that it could be the difference between life and death. She gave a detailed description of the man who had abducted her. He stood about 5'7" and was rather slender, weighing maybe 175 pounds. He spoke with a stutter, wore glasses, and had scars on his face. He had taken her to his home on Old Harbor Road. Once inside, he took her downstairs into a room where the walls were covered with taxidermied animal trophies. Fish, caribou heads, goat heads, ducks, and birds. Which is like super fucking creepy in and of itself. She said there were also what looked like wolf skins and a foosball table in the corner. Cindy was then shackled and raped repeatedly. The man demanded she tell him how much she wanted him, but she couldn't get the words out through her tears. When he was finished with his vicious attack, he wrapped a chain around her neck, anchored it to a bolt, and left her on the floor while he slept on the couch. When he woke up, Cindy begged to go home, swearing she wouldn't tell anyone about what had happened. The man told her that since he liked her so much, he was going to fly her to his cabin, make love to her one more time, and then he would take her home. It is not making love, you sack of fucking shit. It is rape. He told her there had been 7 girls before her, all of which he had kept for a week, saying that he wanted to get his money's worth out of them. He told her that if they did what he wanted, he would bring them home, and left it to her imagination what would happen if they didn't. He put her in his car, barefoot and handcuffed, and placed a heavy green wool blanket over her so that she wouldn't be seen. As he was driving, Cindy remembered hearing about the women going missing from 4th Avenue and the rumors of where they were ending up. She knew that if she got in that plane, she was never coming home. When they arrived at the airfield, he parked and began preparing the cockpit of his bush plane. She was still under the blanket in the back seat when she realized this was her only chance. She jumped from the back seat and ran. The man grabbed his gun and chased after her, but she got away before he could catch up. Officer Baker asked why she chose not to call the police. She told them that she was scared on many different levels. Scared that the police wouldn't believe her. Scared that she'd be back out on her own and the man would find her and finish the job. Scared that she could end up facing legal charges herself due to the nature of her work being illegal. She didn't feel there was anywhere she could go where she would be protected other than back to the motel where she stayed with her pimp. Though he understood her concern, Officer Baker assured her that he believed her. He could tell from the sheer state of terror that she was in that this woman had been through a severely traumatic experience. He asked if she would be willing to undergo a rape examination, and she agreed. On the way to the hospital, they happened to pass Merrill Airfield. They stop and Officer Baker asks if she can identify her attacker's plane. She immediately points it out. As he is taking down the tail number of the plane to track down who it is registered to, a security guard approached. He said he had noticed some suspicious activity earlier that day, and he had taken down the license plate number of the vehicle involved, which he provided to Officer Baker. The license plate number of the car and the tail number of the plane both came back registered to one man, Robert Hansen, who also happened to own a cabin in a remote area near the Knik River. They drive past the address listed as his residence, and Cindy confirms it is the house she had been taken to. Cindy is taken to the hospital for her exam while officers wait for Robert to return home for questioning. When he arrives, he allows police to take a look around, where they find a room in the basement that Cindy had described in incredibly accurate detail. They see a hole in the wood of the stairs where an eye-bolt anchor had likely been screwed. They find a green blanket that matched the one Cindy recalled being covered with. They notice that his car also matches Cindy's statement. Inside, they can see gloves and an ace bandage. However, they didn't have a warrant to search, so they couldn't do much more than take a peek around. Officer Baker takes down all of the initial information, and Robert agrees to come in for a formal interview. Once at the station, he is turned over to a senior officer to discuss the allegations. In Robert's statement, he admits that he had picked Cindy up on the night before she claims the attack happened. He gave his same old excuse that she was simply fabricating the story in an act of retaliation because she had increased the rate after they had finished and he refused to pay. He also says that he has not one, but 2 alibis for the night Cindy claimed to have been held in his basement. He stated that he had dinner with a friend early in the evening and then went over to his neighbor's house around 11:30 p.m. and stayed until about 5 a.m. The senior officer called both of Robert's alibis. The call to the neighbor, who he was reportedly with for the majority of the time he was said to have been kidnapping and assaulting Cindy, lasted about 2 minutes. They do look into Robert's record, but the record converting timed out perfectly in his favor because nothing turns up. After going against her instincts and talking to the police, retelling each and every excruciating moment of what she had been through, Cindy Paulson's report was 27 pages long. She gave them everything she had. But when it was all said and done, it was the word of a 17-year-old sex worker against the word of 3 men. To bolster his innocence, Robert agreed to another search of his home. They again find that the room is exactly as Cindy had described it. They found a hollow spot inside of a wall where he had stored several guns, but none of them matched the guns Cindy described being pulled on her. They asked Robert if he owned a handgun, but he said no. While there, Officer Baker notices that there is a ladder propped up below an attic hatch. He suggested they search it because, people tend to stash things in attics, but the senior officer told him no. Robert had already been cooperative with their investigation, and there was no need to trouble him further. They thanked him and went on their way. After only 11 days, Christie's case was closed and no charges were filed pending further investigation. Detective Maxine Farrell was not working this case, so she was unaware of yet another arrow pointing them in Robert Hansen's direction. The records may not have been available in a quick search, but she had plenty of information at her fingertips. Thankfully, Officer Greg Baker was cut from the same cloth, so he wasn't abandoning his suspicions of Robert either. Officer Baker was convinced that there was more to this man than met the eye, so in a move that was considered to be taboo, he gathered everything he had and turned it over to the Alaska State Troopers. They were aiding in the investigation of some of the missing and murdered women from Anchorage. Shortly after receiving the information about Cindy Paulson's attack, investigators were dealt another blow. On September 2, 1983, the body of 30-year-old Paula Goulding was discovered in a shallow grave along the Knik River by two hunters. She was found with her sweater and bra ripped and her pants unzipped. At her grave, they found another .223 caliber shell casing. Her remains were in a state of advanced decay, but they were able to identify her cause of death as a gunshot wound to the back that had exited through her chest. She was identified by the dental records contained in the missing persons report that Detective Farrell had taken back in April of that year. The bodies of Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding were found within a half-mile of each other, both with .223 caliber shell casings near their bodies in an extremely remote area. Sherry's body was found in an area that could have been reached by vehicle, but Paula's was found in an area that was only accessible by plane or boat. Forensic analysis confirms that both casings were fired from the same gun, a Ruger Mini 14 rifle, proving that both women had been killed by the same person. Sergeant Glenn Floethy had been assigned to the case when the state troopers became involved. He was methodical in his investigation. He agreed that based on the evidence and the location of the bodies, they were dealing with an experienced hunter who was able to traverse a variety of terrains either by owning a plane or a boat. This would narrow things down in most places, but not as much as you would hope here. Not only is hunting extremely common among those who live in Alaska, it is the #1 state to travel to if you want to hunt large game in the United States. Looking over the information Officer Baker had shared, which included Cindy Paulson's report of escaping a man who, based on the description of his trophy room where she was held captive after being abducted and assaulted, was a skilled hunter. The report noted that she had escaped after the man attempted to put her on a plane and take her to a cabin in a remote area. Sergeant Floethy immediately joined the ranks of those who had their sights set on Robert Hansen. While digging into Robert's past, he asked the FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit to put together a profile on the killer based off of the crime scene evidence from the murdered women. And who should happen to work on that profile? None other than Special Agent John Douglas. If the name sounds familiar, it's because he created what is now the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. He literally wrote the book on profiling. If you haven't watched Mindhunter, stop what you're doing right now and go watch it. If you have, you probably already know that Agent Holden Ford's character was based on John Douglas. The man is a legend. While Agent Douglas is doing the damn thing, Sergeant Floethy is too. He has found all of the reported skeletons hiding in Robert Hansen's closet. After finding out about Patty Roberts and Christy Hayes, who both agreed to testify if Robert were brought to trial, he is more certain than ever. But he knows he needs more than his certainty. He needs evidence. To get evidence, you need a warrant. Since Patty and Christy's cases were older, his best shot at getting a warrant would be to go with the most recent case. Cindy had gone back to Portland for a short time after her ordeal with Robert, but was thankfully back in Anchorage. Sergeant Floethy knew that it wouldn't be an easy task to reach her or to get her to speak with him, considering how she had been treated the last time, but he had to try. Cindy's experience with Robert had taken her down a dark road. She fell even deeper into street life, thinking it was the only life she was ever going to have. For a time, Sergeant Floethy wouldn't even come into the office. He would work the night hours that the women of 4th Avenue worked, determined to find her. With the help of some dedicated street officers, he was able to get in touch with Cindy. He listened. He empathized. He took her for coffee. He talked to her about her life. She told him that she had a sister who was deaf and mute, whom she credited for her incredible memory. Learning from her sister, recalling details, smells, and textures became instinctive. After a couple of weeks, she felt safe enough to open up. She agreed to come in and give a recorded interview about the horrific events that she had survived, reliving every painful detail. She said that it still bothered her to think about the other 7 girls Robert had mentioned to her while she was his captive. When Sergeant Floathy asked what she thought happened to them, Cindy said she knows. He killed them. To make sure all bases are covered, she was shown 6 photos of different men and asked to identify the one who attacked her. With zero hesitation, she pointed to the picture of Robert Hansen. Sergeant Floathy learns of Detective Maxine Farrell's extensive work on the case and how she had been the first to suspect Robert Hansen. Following the chain of command, he asks her lieutenant if she can join the investigation, seeing as how this was her case to begin with. Her lieutenant denied the request, stating that Detective Farrell was too busy. Maxine would later say that she believed they were too proud to admit that they had been wrong and that a woman had been right this whole time. After trying to shut her down so many times, to cave and allow her to assist would humiliate them, and they wanted to save what little dignity they had left. Detective Farrell was upset, but still dedicated to putting this bastard behind bars. She gave Sergeant Floathy everything she had on the missing women, including dental records, case histories, and descriptions of their clothing and jewelry. He promised to do justice to her work. Agent Douglas's profile comes back, stating that whoever killed these women was likely an avid hunter, would have a history of being rejected by women, would have low self-esteem, likely had a speech impediment, and would be a family man with a religious wife who was unaware of her husband's activities. The killer would be an active member of the community, likely a business owner, and seen as a good provider for his family. He would be someone who lived a double life with an exceptional ability to compartmentalize. He would keep souvenirs or trophies from his victims. Can I get a round of fucking applause? Like, how did you get all of that? Like, I understand to an extent, but can you, John Douglas, please just sit in a room and tell me just a couple minutes or the rest of my life? Working with Assistant District Attorney Pat Dugan, who I'm guessing is a different ADA than the one in Patty's case, Sergeant Floathy took the FBI's profile, Cindy's statements, and the evidence gathered thus far, and was able to secure a search warrant. Based on what was presented, the judge actually granted them 3. 1 for his home and vehicle, 1 for his bakery, and 1 for his airplane. They coordinated that all warrants would be served at the same time so that Robert wouldn't have the chance to move from one location to another to hide evidence. Sergeant Floathy asks Detective Farrell to join them in the search. She remembers that he said, "I'm not asking your supervisor, I'm asking you." That right there is the energy we need. Sergeant Floathy in that moment is a whole fucking vibe. At 6:30 a.m. on October 27, 1983, APD investigators, including Detective Farrell and Officer Greg Baker, serve the warrant at his home. A team is sent to Merrill Airfield to search the plane, while 2 state troopers serve Robert Hansen as he is leaving his bakery. Robert voluntarily agrees to go in for an interview where Sergeant Floathy, who has been coached by the FBI, is waiting to question him. And let me tell you guys, Sergeant Floathy ran with it. He set the scene. He had a map on the wall of the Knik River with the locations of where the women had been found circled. He had photos of the victims on the tables. He had files laid out purposefully so that Robert could see that they were of his friends and associates. If this interview were taking place today, he probably would have had a whole Spotify playlist going too. He put in the work. Robert is brought in, and for a while, They just let him sit in the rue and stew in the evidence they had gathered so far. Though Sergeant Flothy is the lead investigator, he lets Sergeant Darrell Gallion take the lead on questioning. They ease in at first, just talking about his work, his family, and his life. Then they touch on the arson charge. Once they're warmed up and they get to Patty Roberts, they go hard. Robert goes back to his tried and true dispute over money excuse, but no one is buying the shit he's selling. At Robert's home, the search is well underway. I think I've mentioned this before, but just as a reminder, when you have a search warrant, it doesn't give you free rein. You have to list what you're looking for, and they were looking specifically for the M14 rifle that would match the casings found at the grave sites, the .357 Magnum that Cindy Paulson described during her attack, anything that could be considered a trophy like IDs, jewelry, or clothing that didn't belong to the family, as well as maps of the area where the bodies were found or newspaper clippings pertaining to the cases. Officer Baker recalled seeing the M14 in the wall where Robert stored his guns during their initial search in the Cindy Paulson investigation, but it wasn't collected at the time because Robert hadn't been connected to the murders. Now that they're looking for it, it's gone. They have gone room by room searching, but they're not finding what they're looking for. The wife of the neighbor who provided Robert's alibi for the night of Cindy's attack happens to look over and see the team of investigators searching the home, and the gravity of the situation hits her like a brick. She calls her husband and tells him that he needs to tell the truth. As we've touched on, Robert is seen as a shy, quiet guy to those who he isn't targeting. He was well liked by his neighbors, seen as a loving husband and father and a respected business owner. His double life was his cover, and it worked. When he went to his neighbor, he admitted that he was lonely and he had picked up a sex worker and brought her back to the house. He said that the woman had changed the price on him, and when he refused to pay, she threatened to go to the police and tell them that he had kidnapped and raped her to get back at him. He told his neighbor that he had never done anything like this before, and he was so embarrassed he would surely never do it again. He pled on behalf of Darla. He didn't want her to find out, and he surely didn't want rumors spreading around town that would jeopardize either of their reputations. His neighbor took sympathy on him and agreed to provide an alibi for the indiscretion. Confronted with the reality of who he really was, the neighbor came forward and told investigators the truth, and Robert Hansen's alibi crumbled. Back at the station, Robert hadn't given up anything. They've walked him through his extensive history, but he has an excuse for everything they throw at him. He continually denies having any knowledge of the missing and murdered women. After 5 hours of intense interrogation, he asked for his lawyer, and they ended the interview. Sergeant Flothy was determined that Robert Hansen wasn't going to walk out of that station, so in a bold move, he arrested him on the spot for the kidnap and rape of Cindy Paulson. To top it off, he was also charged with insurance fraud. In 1982, he claimed that his big game trophies had been stolen and collected $13,000, which he used to buy his airplane. Trophies that were sitting in his basement. The charges combined would be enough to hold him while they continued searching. After nearly 12 hours of searching the home, things were starting to look pretty bleak. The only thing of note so far was an aviation map. It was found hidden behind the headboard in the master bedroom and had handwritten X's marking various locations. It's common to mark preferred hunting areas, so since he was a hunter and owns a plane, they didn't think much of it. But the map included the areas where Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding's bodies were found, so they took it into evidence for good measure. Trooper Pat Kasnick had just arrived, and the only area that hadn't been searched was the attic. The same attic that Officer Baker wanted to search but was told not to. The attic ran the entire length of the house. Surprisingly, it wasn't cluttered with seasonal decorations or boxes of things that you swear you're going to take to Goodwill but you never do. It was mostly empty. Still, they needed to clear the area, so crawling on all fours, he began. Though it was empty, it was still 1,800 square feet of space with lots of cracks and crevices. He starts in the back and fairly quickly finds a stash of guns underneath some insulation, including the M14 and the .357 Magnum. It's a damn good start, but they need more. He and another investigator continue, and near the opening of the attic underneath of some insulation, they find a plastic bag. Inside, they find women's watches, jewelry, and driver's licenses. Detective Farrell heard someone yell, "I've got it!" and everyone rushed over. When she looked down at the items, she saw it. The golden arrowhead necklace that Sherry Morrow's boyfriend had mentioned that she always wore when he reported her missing. In that instant, she knew that they were finally going to get the man that she had suspected all along. And it must have been so bittersweet to know that they were going to nail this asshole, but he could have been stopped so much sooner. Sergeant Floathy sends the M14 off for ballistic testing, and for fuck's sake, it gets lost in the mail. While they're trying to locate the gun, he pores over the evidence they gathered from the home, trying to connect it to the other missing women's cases. The team brings in Detective Chuck Miller. He was the one assigned to Joanne Messina's case. She was the 24-year-old dancer who had been found in Seward in July of 1980, who had been murdered by a .22 caliber revolver. Wondering if there could be a connection, they asked Detective Miller to show them on the map they had retrieved from Robert's home where Joanne's body had been found. Detective Miller looked a bit confused. He said, "You've already marked it," and points to an X on the map. They are stunned. They hadn't put that mark on the map. Robert Hansen had. This was the holy fuck moment. I've seen different numbers reported varying from 22 to 37 different X's. Either way, investigators are looking at the map in a whole new light. They quickly realize that there are X's in the spots where Eklutna Annie, Sherry Morrow, and Paula Goulding's bodies were found too. They were hit with the horrifying realization that this was Robert Hansen's murder map. Robert was in jail and awaiting the trial for Cindy Paulson's case, but he hadn't been charged with the murders yet. Most of the evidence they had was circumstantial, and Sergeant Floathy wanted to wait until it was airtight. The gun has been found, and they were now able to confirm that it was the weapon that was used to kill Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding, but this man is on a mission. Now that there is a connection to Joanne Messina and an untold number of other potential victims, he works on getting a second search warrant. The first warrant didn't allow them to seize all of Robert's guns, only the ones they needed for the case they were working. Now that they suspected him and many more using a variety of weapons, they wanted them all. The second warrant was approved on January 13, 1984 for all of his ammunition, rifles, handguns, shotguns, and bows. The next day, Robert received a copy of the warrant while in jail, which listed the items to be seized and why they were being seized. Robert's defense attorney, Joe Evans, received a call from him in February, just 1 week before his trial for Cindy Paulson was set to take place. He told Joe that he wanted to, quote, clear the decks, and asked him to get in touch with the DA to set up a meeting. Robert knew that it wouldn't be long before the ground would thaw and teams would be looking underneath those X's, so his options for bargaining were limited and his window was closing. It is thought that part of the reason Robert agreed to confess in exchange for a plea bargain was out of concern for his wife and the publicity surrounding the case. The terms of his plea bargain would be that he would only be charged with the murders of the 4 women they had already found. He requested that all charges be done in one trial, which actually saved the state millions of dollars and countless man-hours. He requested that no press be allowed in the courtroom, and that after sentencing he would be placed in federal prison. In exchange, he would confess to all of his crimes while only pleading guilty to the 4 murders, and lead them to where the bodies of his other victims were buried when the ground thawed. His confession took several hours. His lawyer, Joe Evans, recalls that the hair on the back of his neck stood up as he sat and listened to Robert describe the killings. Robert originally tried to downplay the number of murders, but eventually admitted that 17 of the X's on the map were locations of women he had killed. He confessed that in addition to the 17 women he had murdered, he had raped upwards of 30. He told investigators, quote, there's just some things that even if you're married to a woman, you just don't do with your wife. It was all right on these here prostitutes. I could do things with them that I couldn't do with a good woman. He gave details on some of the cases and was vague on the others. He said that Eklutna Annie was his first. He couldn't remember her name or if she was a dancer or a sex worker. He picked her up and drove to a remote area. He knew where the roads were, including the ones that weren't on the maps. He also knew where hunters would likely be, and more importantly, where they wouldn't be. Experience will only get you so far, though. The roads were difficult to navigate, and his car got stuck. Seeing her opportunity, Annie ran. She had a knife in her purse that she pulled out to defend herself with. When he caught up with her, he tripped her to the ground, took her knife, and stabbed her to death. Joanne Messina was someone he had met while she was camping. They were flirty, and she agreed to have dinner with him. He initially thought of her as a good girl, but when she offered to exchange sex for money, a switch flipped in his head, and he now considered her a bad girl. He was enraged that she didn't want him, she only wanted money. He drove her to her campsite, shot her twice, and then proceeded to shoot her German Shepherd who was trying to protect her. As if the world needed any more reason to hate you, you shot a dog who was trying to protect their owner? I hope you stepped on glass barefoot every single day for the rest of your life. He said that with Paula Goulding, he had offered her $200 to take nude photographs of her. When she showed up, he abducted her, put her in his plane, and flew her out to a remote area. She fought back and escaped. As she was running away, he shot her in the back. He had also offered Sherry Morrow money to take nude photographs of her, and again, flew her out into the wilderness and shot her in the back as she was running away. Though he didn't admit to it, neither Sherry or Paula's clothing had bullet holes, so it is believed that he killed them while they were naked, put their clothes back on them, and then buried them in shallow graves. A running theme throughout his confession was that it was always the woman's fault. It was her fault that she got murdered because she fought back. She screamed. She tried to run. She didn't want to do what he wanted her to do. She only wanted money. Which, sidebar, he targeted women who specifically work in the adult entertainment and sex work industry. Their job is to receive money for services rendered. He offered to pay them money for those services, and when they accepted it, he got upset. Make it make sense. I'm just going to cut through the bullshit here. He wanted to be desired by women. If a woman didn't desire him, he took pleasure in getting what he wanted anyways by raping her and then killing her. He felt he had a right to these women, and when he felt his right was denied, he took their lives. It is so sickening that I cannot stand it. He says that all they had to do was do what he wanted, and if they did, he would let them go. It's on them that they didn't comply. They should have just sat there and taken it. I need mouthwash after saying that, you guys. He said that with some of the women, he only intended to scare the living shit out of them, but it escalated. The others, the non-compliant ones, he would purposefully release into the wilderness where he would track and hunt them for hours or even days. And on occasion, he would just snap and kill them in a fit of rage. He kidnapped, raped, physically and psychologically tortured, and killed innocent women because he had a case of the woe is me, women don't like me. Gee, I fucking wonder why. On Monday, February 27th, 1983, just 4 days after his plea agreement and confession, Robert's sentencing began. The courtroom was packed with family members of the victims, survivors, and against his wishes, journalists. Good. Prosecutor Frank Rothschild wore a red rose on his lapel in honor of the women. There was no trial, but he still wanted to make it clear to the judge and to those in attendance exactly who Robert Hansen was. He said, quote, "Before you sits a monster, an extreme aberration of a human being, a man who walked among us for 17 years, serving us donuts, danishes, and hot coffee, all with a pleasant smile." Which is just so bone-chilling. Judge Moody presided over Robert's case and imposed the maximum possible sentence allowed under Alaska's law at the time, 461 years in prison, with an additional life sentence without the possibility for parole, just for good measure. Judge Moody didn't stop there. He admonished the courts, the police, and everyone along the way who failed these women, saying, quote, "Law enforcement had a bias, and far too many women paid for it." He didn't remember the names of some of the victims, but thanks to exhaustive research, all except for Eklutna Annie have been identified. Combined with the dates, locations, details given in his confession, and information from their missing persons reports, we have some idea of their stories. 18-year-old Celia Van Zanten disappeared from Anchorage on December 22, 1971. She was abducted, bound, sexually assaulted, and stabbed in the chest. She was dumped into a ravine while still alive, but died from exposure. Robert denied responsibility for her death, but there was an X on his map directly over the spot where she was left. 17-year-old Megan Emmerich vanished from Seward, Alaska on July 7, 1973. Robert initially denied killing her, but admitted he was in Seward on the day she disappeared. Her body was also found under an X on his map. Later, he admitted to a former inmate that he had taken her to a cabin that was only accessible by boat, raped, killed, and buried her. 22-year-old Mary Thill disappeared from Seward, Alaska on July 5, 1975. Same story as Megan. He denied killing her, though he admitted being in the area. He must be a talker in prison because he confessed to another inmate to discarding her body in Resurrection Bay after murdering her, right where an X was placed on his map. 24-year-old Roxanne Eastland vanished from Anchorage, Alaska on June 28, 1980, after having an appointment to meet with a man on 4th Avenue. Robert confessed to raping and killing her, but her body was never found. 41-year-old Lisa Futrell was kidnapped by Robert on September 6, 1980, after meeting him in a club where she was working. He confessed that he raped and murdered her before burying her body next to a gravel pit near the Kinnick Arm Bridge. 28-year-old Malia Larson was abducted by Robert on July 10, 1981. Her body was discovered on April 24, 1984, in a parking lot near the Kinnick Bridge. 24-year-old Andrea Altieri had an appointment with Robert where he had agreed to pay to take nude photographs of her on December 2, 1982. After kidnapping her, he admitted to blindfolding, handcuffing, and sexually assaulting her. She fought back and he shot her. He tied a duffel bag weighed down with gravel to her body and threw her off of the bridge into the Kinnick River. Her body was never found, but her jewelry was among some of the items seized from his home. 23-year-old Sue Luna agreed to allow Robert to take nude photographs of her for money on May 6, 1982. Instead, he kidnapped and raped her before telling her to flee into the forest naked, where he hunted and shot her. 20-year-old Tammy Peterson last spoke with her family on August 7, 1982. She told them that she had an appointment with a man who had offered to pay her to pose for some photos. Robert abducted, raped, and murdered her in the woods. Her body was not discovered until April 29, 1984. 24-year-old Angela Federn disappeared from Anchorage, Alaska in February of 1983. Robert kidnapped and raped her before killing her near the Figure 8 Lake. Her body was found on April 16, 1984. 22-year-old Dylan Frey was abducted, raped, and killed by Robert in March of 1983. Her body was discovered by the Kinnick River, but she was not identified until 1989, when some of the jewelry found on her body matched what was noted in her missing persons file, and other pieces were recognized in Robert's collection of trophies. 22-year-old Teresa Watson left for a date with Hansen on March 25, 1983. He kidnapped and raped her. After murdering her, he was unable to bury her because the ground was frozen, so he simply abandoned her body. Her remains were discovered on April 26, 1984. 19-year-old Robin Pelkey disappeared from Anchorage, Alaska on July 19, 1983. She was abducted and raped before being shot and stabbed. Her partial remains were found in Palmer on April 25, 1984. She remained unidentified, known as Horseshoe Harriet, because she is one of the women whose names Robert couldn't remember. Thanks to forensic genealogy, she was identified in October of 2021. As I said in part 1, I won't be speaking negatively of Robert's wife, Darla, and I have purposefully not named their children. Robert was the monster. People often say, "How could you not know? How could you be living with or married to someone like this and not know what they were doing?" What we need to understand is that people like Robert Hansen are skilled at hiding their true selves, even from those closest to them. Darla did say that she knew he went to the strip clubs from time to time, and that he had probably engaged in activities with sex workers. When asked if she had any idea about the extent of what he had done, she said, quote, "Who could imagine anyone doing these things, much less your husband?" It really broke my heart to read that, because she was another woman whose life was shattered by this man. I hope that Darla and her children were able to overcome the traumatic realization of who Robert was and move on with their lives peacefully. I hope that Patty Roberts, Christy Hayes, Cindy Paulson, and any other potential victims that we do not know about were able to put the damage Robert caused them behind them and go on to have all the happiness they deserve. Robert Hansen was a fucking demon. A horrible, awful, disgusting waste of perfectly good molecules. He served out his days imprisoned in the Spring Creek Correctional Facility in Seward, Alaska. He died on August 14th, 2014 at the age of 75. My greatest hope is that each one of the women he terrorized was waiting for him on the other side, and that he is trapped in an endless cycle of being hunted by them. Rest in every bit of distress, motherfucker. Identification attempts continue to this day for Eklutna Annie, including forensic genealogy attempts. If you have any information, you can contact the Alaska State Troopers at 907-269-5511 and ask for Malia Miller. You can also call the Anchorage Police Department at 907-786-8900 and reference case number 80-43262. And that, my friends, is the conclusion of the case of Robert Hansen, also known as the Butcher Baker. That's all I've got for you today, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. If you would like to make a donation to the podcast, there will be a support the show link in the show notes, or you can go to buymeacoffee.com/criminallynerdypodcast. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Criminally Nerdy Podcast, Twitter, X, whatever, at Crime Nerd Pod, or shoot me an email anytime at criminallynerdypodcast@gmail.com. Till next time, keep it nerdy. I can be a boyfriend. Blah, blah, blah. It's not December, it's October. It's spooky season, bitches. That was my belly. No, motherfucker. Initial. Oh, that's just my knee cracking. Da. Fucking bullshit. Getting old is fun. Dawn Draper. No, I'll just delete that. Delete. Cindy Lou Who. Abducted, da. This makes no fucking sense to me. That's not his fucking name. Ale Emporium. Coffee. Inner. Show. This is gonna be fun. Now I want some Hermanaki wings. Like Marge Simpson. Homer. I cannot talk today. Okay. I'm never gonna say that already. Blech! Damn it, I don't like that either. Cry, baby. I hope that thing hasn't been bubbling in the microphone this whole time. In it. She sells seashells by the seashore. Is it a rifle or I don't know anything about guns. Come on, Betty. Clue. Explain it to me like I'm 5. Galleon? I should have looked that up. I'm just making up words. Please don't make me say this. Discovered. I really hate this dude. Oh, God. No, fuck. Fuck this guy. The price is wrong, bitch.